Welcome to my next Monday Bagel episode when we dive into the pivotal world of AI and its integration into corporate strategies. Today, I'm thrilled to have a distinguished guest, James Gatto, a leader in AI, blockchain, and fintech at Sheppard Mullin for US law firm, an adjunct professor at the University of Mississippi School of Law. James brings a wealth of knowledge on the intersection of technology and law, especially in how AI policies are shaped and acted across different regions. James, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
To kick things off, could you share your US experience and explain why it's crucial for US companies to establish the AI policies?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, my background, just briefly, I've been doing AI work for about 20 years. And so I've seen the space evolve pretty significantly recently, particularly in light of generative AI. And I think companies have always needed AI policies. But with generative AI, there's kind of a host of new legal issues that are distinct from what's kind of gone before. And it's really those distinct issues that create a need for policies. So just by way of very brief example, with generative AI, it's creating new content and it's being trained on a lot of data, which may include copyrighted material, privacy protected information, and other types of stuff. And we can get into more of the legal issues. But because of this, what we're seeing is companies have two options. They can kind of do nothing and let employees do what they want to do because employees are using AI whether companies have a policy or not. The biggest problem with that is for many of the tools that are out there, there's an individual version that users can use for free, which is what employees are doing, or there's an enterprise version. And there's very significant differences both in the operation of those tools and the legal terms associated with those tools. So very simple examples. If you put input into one of the free versions, the individual version, that input is not confidential. That input can be used by the AI tool company with some of the tools. It varies by tool. The input can be used by the tool company to retrain the model, and that input may actually get output to somebody else. We've seen stories in the news of very big companies that I won't name that have had people put confidential information in, and it has come out. So that's one example. But another really big example that many people don't understand is that with a lot of these tools, the individual version, the terms of service say that if the output infringes third-party IP, you can't use it. And if you use it, you indemnify the tool provider if they get sued. If you use the enterprise version, many of the tools, they'll indemnify you. So those are just two very, very important business issues for companies. You'd much rather be having your input confidential, and you'd much rather be getting an indemnity than giving an indemnity. The problem is employees don't read the terms of service. And if you're not using the enterprise version, there's these and other risks. So part of what the policies involve, there's kind of really three steps in our view with the policies. And this is a lot of the work that I'm doing with companies right now. One is you have to form an AI governance committee. Companies need to have representatives from different parts of the company, board level, C-level, legal department, users, people from the creative side, people on the tech side. It depends on the company, but a representative sample of people to weigh in. Second, they need education. The law is changing very quickly, and many people, it's not their job to stay up on the law, but you cannot make effective policies around legal issues if you don't understand the law and the ramifications. So that's the second one. So we're doing a lot of training of companies to help them understand these issues. And it's not do it once and forget it. It's you have to do it, and this stuff's changing constantly. And then the third thing is you have to adopt policies once you do that. And part of the important thing with policies, there's many aspects, but I'll just mention one more thing and then pause, is that, as I alluded to earlier, it's really important to understand the different tools, the different features of the tools, and to decide, in our view, in most cases, you need to approve specific tools that are usable by the company based on what the terms of service are, the features of the tool, including the safety features. Does it protect your confidential information or not, and various other things. So we can go into it more, but let me kind of pause there.
Thank you. I've been creating AI policies also for last few years, maybe not 20 as you. We didn't have AI business in Poland, in Europe for 20 years. But so far we've had no clear regulations. But for the last few months, we Europeans have almost final text of AI Act, and we have legal basis to design AI compliance system. How does it look in the US? We in the EU know the timeline. We know that we have to be ready within next few months. And how is it in the US?
So it's a little different in the U.S. right now. There's a little bit of new legislation, but for the most part, what we're seeing is existing law being applied to AI. It's not custom AI specific law, and so part of it is understanding what laws are relevant and how they apply. And there's some debate. There's a number of lawsuits pending on some of these issues because they're open questions. But we will be getting more law. The White House issued an executive order back in October with 150 mandates for different agencies to come up with guidelines, regulations, enforcement actions, and a whole bunch of different things. And those are in the works. But those are more regulatory type issues as opposed to new laws. So I'll take a simple example, the FTC, which deals with data privacy, data protection, and other consumer protection issues broadly. They don't have a specific AI mandate, but within the broad scope of their law, they can control anything that's data related. So one of the issues that's happened, and this is another reason you need policies, is the FTC has gone after people who have used data that they don't have a right to use to train AI, and they've done enforcement actions. And the result of those actions is what they call algorithmic disgorgement. And what algorithmic disgorgement is that if you've trained a model with data, you don't have a right to use it. You have to delete the data and the model and any algorithms that are impacted by it. That's significant because companies, as you know, are spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to train these models. So if you do that based on data you don't have a right to use, you're going to lose that entire investment. And that's not theoretical. That's happened to several companies, and it's going to happen to more. So part of the policy is ensuring you understand what data you have a right to use and what you don't. And one of the biggest misunderstandings right now is that there's many companies, I'm sure you work with them, everyone, companies have collected data for years on their customers, and they've collected it legally. They legally possess the data. The problem is the privacy policies under which they've collected that data didn't envision using it to train AI. And companies are saying, we're sitting on this trove of information. We have this incredible amounts of valuable data, and we should train AI models with it. And that's what they're doing. And a lot of companies don't have the right to do it. So even though you possess the data, unless you have a right to use it, you may run into algorithmic disgorgement. That's just one example. So more broadly, to finish the question on the legislation, there's about 40 federal, unlike Europe where there's more centralization and then I don't think it pushed out into individual countries, we don't have that. We have so many different agencies that have a finger in the pot and they govern different parts of it. We don't have a comprehensive AI law, and we will not. The White House executive order sets out mandates, but it charges the different agencies with doing different things. So, and Congress, there's about at least 40 bills pending that I'm tracking that are AI related. And then there's state laws. So we still have this dichotomy of both federal and state. Just like we do in the privacy sector, we only have state laws. There's now a federal privacy bill that's pending. It may or may not pass. We'll see what happens. So the short answer to your question is, what's it like in the U.S.? It's a mess, like it always is. You have to understand the state law. You have to understand the different agencies that are imposing regulations and guidance and doing enforcement. And you have to look at both federal and the state level.
So this was what I wanted to ask next. How do you manage to approach all these different state jurisdictions when you lack one federal law? You apply the law that most fits your targeted clients, or that is most strict for AI-based tools. What's your approach? What's your advice?
In part, you can do that. So like we take privacy, right? There's like California has a privacy law that's pretty analogous to GDPR in some respects, and that's deemed to be among the strictest, but most other states have a privacy law as well. For some legal areas, if you take the approach you mentioned, like take the strictest one and comply, you may get most of the way there. But there's some states that have requirements that are just not even in, like it's different than what's in one of the strictest ones. So it's not just there's like, you have to understand each of the state laws. And yes, in many cases you can, design it to accommodate the strictest law, but there may be other things you need to do as well. So as part of the reason that you really need to just keep abreast of what's going on in, both at the federal and state level and the different regulatory agencies, and factor all of it in is really the short answer.
I understood you that in the US you have to be ready now for AI, and you have to have your AI governance system being prepared or almost ready. So what are the key components that should be included? You mentioned some, but maybe there are some other crucial ones to include.
Sure. So the way I look at it is we use what we call role-based AI policies. And what we mean by role-based policies is that different companies are interacting with AI in different ways. So there's some companies that are just collecting data that they're licensing to other, or they have data that they're licensing to other people to train models. So if you're just collecting data, there's a set of laws that apply to you. Your policy needs to cover that. There's companies that are training AI models. There's companies that are licensing in third-party models and building applications using those models or fine-tuning those models. There's companies that are just using third-party models and not doing any training or fine-tuning or anything. Then there's companies that are just using content that's generated by third parties. So if you hire an independent contractor to create content for you, you need to make sure that you establish policies on what they can and can't do with respect to deliverables for you. So for example, in the US and I believe in many other jurisdictions, the output of generative AI is typically not protectable. So if you're paying someone to create content for you that you want to be copyrightable, they can't use generative AI to do that. So you need to know how they're generating that content. Or it may be that it's okay for certain circumstances that they use generative AI. But again, the policy should address that. So depending on where you are in that spectrum, and many companies are fitting into multiple of the buckets that I just talked about. So the first thing to understand is, what are the laws that apply to the activities that you're engaged in with respect to AI? And then from there, you can develop the policies, right? So if you're using AI, as I mentioned, you want to figure out which tools you're going to use. You have to figure out what use cases are acceptable for you. So as I mentioned, simple example is, if you're a company that relies on protecting content and licensing it, and you want to have copyright protection, you don't want to use generative AI to output it. You may permit people to use generative AI to create content for inspiration, but people independently create their own work, not copying the AI. Those are just very simple examples. If you're building AI, if you're either training or building applications, it's much more complicated. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has published what I think is the best guidance, and we use that as a starting point, what they call their AI risk management framework. And it identifies the various principles of the things that you need to consider to build what they call responsible AI. Something that's accurate, transparent, doesn't have bias, doesn't have discrimination, it's explainable, all the things that go into responsible AI. You need to make sure you have policies that are dealing with all of that. So with that said, the answer is it depends on what you're doing, what needs to be in there, but it's all driven by both the legal issues and kind of industry best practices for responsible AI and your company's use, your risk tolerance, and kind of, if you have applications that are, in a regulated industry. So if you're doing a medical application, for example, then you have to make sure that you're only providing medical information and not medical advice, for example. So you have to be able to constrain what the outputs are. So it's case by case, and that's why there's so much to understand, that for companies that really haven't done this before, they just need to work with people like you or other experts that can help guide them on the range of issues until they really get comfortable with that, and make sure that they're not missing anything that really needs to be into the policies, to identify what the topics are. And then for each of the topics, there's many business choices that'll be specific to the company.
I fully agree with this advice, but Designing AI policy is one side of the coin. Are you involved also in developing, maintaining it, monitoring, enforcement of these policies? What can you share some best practices?
Yeah, so that definitely varies by company, and it's a great question. You can write a policy, but if no one uses it, it's just, it's just like you don't have a policy. So it's really important to implement it. So one of the things that a couple of things that we recommend to companies to address those issues. First of all, this needs to be mandated from the top of the company down, right? This can't just be a legal department exercise, right? It needs to come from the CEO or the board or some high level. People understand this is not optional. These aren't guidelines. These are rules, right? And so you have to have that. Second is, and you need to be careful how you do this, but you want to have some monitoring, right? You want to have people that are understanding, are people using what we say, are people using tools they're not supposed to use, right? And that you get into employee monitoring and there's some limits what you can do, but there's certain things you can do. And then the third is there has to be consequences. And this is where it varies by company. I mean, if someone, violates the policy, maybe the first time you give them a warning, but you tell them if you do it again, you're going to get fired. And people, you fire somebody, people will start looking and say, this is real. Now, you don't want to, use that as your initial approach is just go out and fire people, but there needs to be one other thing is employee education. A lot of these tools and the policies that are developed, the reasons for some of the things that go into the policy are not clear to employees. And we find that when you do training and employees understand the issues, they're more willing to comply. They're not, it's not like, oh, this is just a bunch of dumb rules the lawyers came up with, right? So, I think it's like any other policy to a certain extent, right? It varies by company, but I really think that the top down, the employee education, and some level of monitoring and enforcement are the main components.
After this discussion, I see that both EU and US have a lot in common, but I wonder how to create a AI governance policy that would work and be effective both in the EU and US. We have this AI risk-based approach that comes from EU AI Act, and how to harmonize this approach with the US approach. Do you have any comments on that or experience?
Yes, we do. So, a lot of companies were, helping them, and in many cases, we're working with European Council. But, I understand that the EU AI Act may have implications for U.S. companies, even if you're building the technology here. If it's going to be used in Europe, for example, it may be covered. So it needs to be taken into account. And the EU Act obviously is probably the most significant legislation in the world right now with respect to AI, most comprehensive and forward thinking. But there's laws coming out of other jurisdictions as well, and so I think if you're playing on the international scale, you need to factor all that into account. There are a lot of similarities. Well, the EU AI Act is primarily risk based. We're seeing like different agencies in the U.S. are dealing with some of the risk-based stuff. So we've seen the EEOC, which is the Employment Commission, dealing with the use of AI in employment decisions, and they've engaged in some actions where there's been discrimination, for example. And so, while we don't have a comprehensive law that say here's the high-risk uses of AI and here's how they're regulated, we're seeing that through agency action, the EEOC, the FTC. We're seeing it with housing, right? If you're making housing decisions, consumer finance decisions, anything that can have an impact on consumers is some level of high risk, right? Where it is on the spectrum kind of varies, but we're seeing it through regulatory action anyhow. So I think it's more aligned, I think, than some people think it is, but we don't have a comprehensive law that does it. So I think you need to develop for similar principles for both jurisdictions.
Okay, so I think the conclusion is work together both on the US side with good experts, experienced ones like you, and European ones, and maybe UK, and then Asian and other jurisdictions.
Yes.
This is the only solution that may be adopted. James, it's been an incredibly enlightening discussion. Your insights clarify the complexities of AI implementation and I think provide a look into the practice of law. Thank you for sharing your experience with us today.
My pleasure. Just if I may, just one last thing. So I enjoyed this. If people want to reach out and have questions, two things I would say. One is we have a blog that we blog almost daily. I mean, there's so much happening. We have the AI team that I run. We have about 100 lawyers, so we have people covering different legal and industry areas. And we post a lot of blog posts. It's at ailawandpolicy.com. You can sign up and get updates. And as far as me, I do a lot of blog posting, but I also post a lot on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, just James Gatto on LinkedIn, please feel free to reach out. I love having these conversations with people. I learn when I talk to people based on their questions, I learn kind of where the knowledge gaps are, and it helps me explain things better. And that's part of why I teach too, is you have to understand and learn stuff in a different way to be able to teach it. And so I find it fascinating in these areas. So please feel free to contact me if you're interested.
I will link all this information under the podcast. I follow your LinkedIn and I strongly recommend following it as well. I follow the website you mentioned. I strongly recommend anyone interested in AI implementation to follow it too. And to our listeners, I hope if you found this discussion as informative as we did, so subscribe, give thumbs up, leave a review, and follow us, follow me, follow Jim. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you, Michael.